And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and these are the 10 best cards for the Commander format from Brothers War. All in all, I did not think this was a phenomenal set for Commander. You know, I go through once everything has been spoiled, I pick out a bunch of cards that I think are pretty good, and once I actually get my top 10 list together, I'm looking at it and I'm going, yeah, these are okay. You know, they're not super good. They're not super impactful. I think there is a couple of cards here that could be pretty impactful in the format, but not a whole lot. I'm not complaining. This is not a Commander set. It is a standard set, and it doesn't need to be fantastic for Commander. As long as we can find a few cards that are great for the Commander format, I'm fine with that, especially considering all of the ridiculous amount of product we've been getting lately. Getting a bit of a dud in the Commander format, I'm totally okay with that. So I'm going to start out with an honorable mention, and it's going to be one with the multiverse, a card that I'm sure has gotten a lot of buzz already. 6 blue enchantment. So an 8-mana enchantment, that's quite a bit, but this is the Commander format, let's not forget. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. That's great. Just having that ability alone is pretty handy. You may play lands and cast spells from the top of your library. That's also a fantastic ability, of course. And also, once during each of your turns, you may cast a spell from your hand or the top of your library without paying its mana cost. So this is sort of a mini Omniscience and also Future Sight combined, right? We're taking a bunch of stuff from Future Sight, also taking some stuff from Omniscience here, combining it into one card, giving it, I would say, a middle of the road, right in between casting cost, a pretty appropriate casting cost in my opinion. It is 8 mana. It's not going to end the game. There's no way anyone's just going to be able to play this like they would in Omniscience and just go, okay, end of the game, I guess we'll shuffle up and play again. This is only going to let you play on each of your turns one spell from your hand or something from the top of your library if whatever is on top of your library is better. It's great value. Just everything on here is pretty fantastic. You could pretty much put this in any deck in a Commander game, and it is going to be very helpful for you. I don't know if it specifically goes anywhere, but it is pretty darn good, and it's going to see play in the format. All right, getting to the list, starting out at number 10, Bitter Reunion. 1 and a red enchantment. When Bitter Reunion enters the battlefield, you may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards. Also, you can pay 1 and sacrifice Bitter Reunion. Creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. So I know this card doesn't look like much. It's probably a card that's going to get played a lot in Standard, maybe even Modern, but I think for sure this card is going to see a ton of play in the format, or at least it should. You know, when I make these lists, it is a combination of cards that are sort of those utility cards that you could definitely see a lot of in the format that maybe aren't so flashy, but do give you a lot of value. And then also I have a lot of cards that are the flashy cards that are definitely going to see play in the format because they do something really unique or powerful. This is definitely the former. And I will just throw out the comparison to Thrill of Possibility, right? 1 on a red instant, as an additional cost to cast a spell, discard a card, draw 2 cards. So it's doing essentially the same thing that Bitter Reunion is doing. Thrill of Possibility is currently in 95,000 decks on EDH Rec. That's a whole lot of decks. People like this card a lot, and Bitter Reunion for me is straight up better. I know people will say, okay, well, Thrill of Possibility is an instant. Sure, that is nice, but being able to sacrifice this at a later date and give your team haste, I think the advantage there trumps the instant that you're getting from Thrill of Possibility. So I think it would be very easy for 95,000 decks to just take out Thrill of Possibility and put this in instead. So that's why I think I got to give it a mention here. Coming in at number 9, Tocassia's Welcome. 2 and a white enchantment. Whenever one or more creatures with mana value 3 or less enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. So whenever we get a new white card draw spell, I just don't even know how to rate it anymore. I mean, quite frankly, if this card came out a year ago, everyone would probably be losing their mind over it, just like they did with Welcoming Vampire, which is very comparable. In fact, they're almost the exact same card. The difference is here you care about mana value 3 and Welcoming Vampire cares about power 2 or less. I think Tocassia's Welcome is just a straight up improvement over Welcoming Vampire for a couple of reasons. Reason number 1, it's an enchantment, so it's going to be a lot harder for your opponents to get it off the board, whereas your Welcoming Vampire will just incidentally die to somebody's board wipe, right? Also though, the power 2 or less thing really can sort of hold you back. If you look a lot of tribal themes like Soldier Tribal, stuff stuff like that, a lot of common tribes in white colors, you're going to be wanting to do the Anthem effect a lot. So a lot of times if you use those anthems on your creatures, it will turn off your Welcoming Vampire. It's not going to turn off Cassia's Welcome though, because that only cares about mana value. So I can throw as many token creatures into play as I want. They can have power 3 or 4 or whatever. They're still going to be less than a 3 mana value, right? They'll probably be mana value 0. So if I'm doing like a Soldier Tribal, Knight Tribal deck, chances are all of the creatures in my deck are going to be mana value 3 or less. And even if I bump their power, it's not going to shut off my Cassie's Welcome. So I think it is just a straight up improvement to a Welcoming Vampire, which is a card that most people really love, right? Coming in at number 8, Hulking Metamorph. 9 mana artifact creature, shapeshifter 7/7. That's pretty pricey. However, it has this new ability from Brothers War Prototype. Very interesting ability, which is very significant in the Commander format, of course, because you have the blue pips there. So on this particular card, it's 2 blue and a blue, which is an alternate casting cost, right? And we all know how alternate casting costs work in Magic. We are going to use the 2 blue instead of the 9 colorless. We can use either one, right? If we cast this for the 2 blue, it has the different mana cost, the different color, and also a different power and toughness. And in this case, it's a 3/3. So I'm going to cast this for 4 mana, 2 blue. It's now a blue card, a blue creature. So when I cast it, it's going to be a blue card on the stack. When it hits the battlefield, it'll also be a blue card because there's blue pips in the mana cost. And instead of a 7/7, it'll be a 3/3. And of course, because of those blue pips, we can only play this in a deck that has the blue color identity, right, in the Commander format. You may have Hulking Metamorph enter the battlefield as a copy of an artifact or creature you control, except it's an artifact creature in addition to its other types, and its power and toughness are equal to Hulking Metamorph's power and toughness. There's a lot of really neat things going on here. This card is basically a Phyrexian Metamorph and also a Quicksilver Gargantuan combined in one, I think, because it's sort of doing what both of those cards are doing, and you can pick either one. Now, a 4 mana clone effect is pretty good. You're not going to want to copy a giant creature here if you pay the 2 blue, because that creature is going to be a 3/3. However, if you want to copy a little creature, like say your Cephalid Constable, I can pay the 4 and make a 3/3 Cephalid Constable, pretty good, but I can also pay the 9 and a 7/7 Cephalid Constable. That's pretty fantastic. So I like that we have those options there. However, the most significant part of this card, I think, is that you're copying an artifact or creature, except you're making an artifact creature. So if you are copying a creature, it's then going to be an artifact creature, but you can also just copy a regular old artifact, which will then be an artifact creature, and that can be incredibly significant. I like all the options that are going on here. As a clone effect, this is one of the most interesting ones we have in the format now, I think. Coming in at number 7, Scavenged Brawler. 6 mana, artifact creature, construct, 4/4, flying, vigilance, trample, lifelink. That's a whole lot of abilities. Pay 5, exile Scavenger Brawler from your graveyard. Choose target creature, put 4 +1/+1 counters, a flying counter, a vigilance counter, a trample counter, and a lifelink counter on that creature. Activate only as a sorcery. This is definitely, I think, a card that's going to see a lot of play in the format. It is very easily going to slot into a whole bunch of decks. The first kind of deck it's going to slot into is the Voltron deck, right? Because this is a whole lot of stuff that you can give to your commander. Now, of course, it's got to be in the graveyard in order to use it. It's not a bad thing to have a 4/4 flying, vigilance, trample, lifelink creature on the table. You can be smacking your opponent with it every turn, gaining 4 life, hold it up as a blocker. It's an artifact creature, so your opponents can very easily remove it, but you don't care because you kind of want it in your graveyard, right? Being able to put 4 counters on your Voltron commander, give it flying, vigilance, trample, and lifelink from one card is amazing. The other fantastic fit, I think, for this card, and remember, it's a colorless card. I always like to bump those colorless cards up the list because they can go in any deck. This is a fantastic fit in any discard theme or any graveyard theme, in my opinion, because it's very easy to chuck this guy into your graveyard and then pay the 5 at a later time to give your commander or any creature all these abilities. This is absolutely a card I'm going to throw in my mono red discard deck, my Bralin deck, because I have a whole bunch of discard already. So why not put a card in that deck that I can very easily chuck in my graveyard, and then a few turns later, I'll pay the 5, put 4 counters on my commander, which I already want to be doing, and then give it flying, vigilance, trample, and lifelink. So now I'm going to have this giant commander that I usually don't attack with, but it's going to be very easy to do so. I think this is going to be a fantastic include in a lot of commander decks. Coming in at number 6, Sky Fisher Spider, 2 black and a green, Spider 3/3 with reach. When Sky Fisher Spider enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another creature. When you do, destroy target non-land permanent. When Sky Fisher Spider dies, you gain 1 life for each creature card in your graveyard. If you do, exile Sky Fisher Spider from your graveyard. I really love this card. This might be a card that flies under the radar for a lot of people, but this is the kind of card that I absolutely love. I talked about in a video recently about how I love multicolored cards, I love removal, and I really love abilities stapled on creatures, and this is doing all of those. This is a creature that gives you removal when it ETBs and also has a nice other little ability stapled on it as well. First things first, if you got a Spider Tribal deck, right, one of those black-green Spider Tribal decks, this is an auto include in there. If you have one of those black-green life gain decks, there's a bunch of those out there. I also think this is a fantastic include because we have that life gain clause at the bottom, but this to me is a card that can go in any Golgari deck because it is a fantastic removal option. I'm going to play this. It ETBs, I sacrifice another creature. Heck, that's not usually difficult in a Golgari deck. When I do, I destroy target non-land permanent. That's pretty fantastic, right? Being able to hit any non-land permanent. Now I have a 3/3 creature with reach. It's a fantastic blocker, and when it dies, I may gain 1 life, and I love the wording there because this is a may. I don't have to do this. If I want to gain the life, I can exile this from my graveyard, and I will gain 1 life for each creature card in my graveyard. Again, something that black and green decks usually have a lot of, but again, in a Golgari deck, I have a lot of recursion probably. Maybe I'm playing that Marin deck or something. Now, I maybe don't want to gain the life. I don't really need it. I would more rather get my Sky Fisher Spider back out of the graveyard, so I'm not going to use that ability. I'm going to leave it there so I can get it back. Maybe I'll do the exile thing at a later time when I need the life, right? So I really like the may on that last ability where I can choose, maybe I want to recur it, or maybe I do need the life. A lot going on in this card. I really think it fits in a ton of decks. Coming in at number 5, Wondrous Crucible, 7 mana artifact. Permanents you control have Ward 2. At the beginning of your end step, mill 2 cards, then exile a non-land card at random from your graveyard. Copy it. You may cast the copy. So this really is one of those sort of big splashy, maybe battle cruiser type of cards that could literally go in any commander deck. I mean, it's a colorless artifact, so it can go in any deck. Having permanents you control of Ward 2 is phenomenal, and then that other ability is pretty fantastic as well, right? Just giving you that free value every turn on your end step. I guess it's probably extra good in a deck where you want to be milling yourself. Some decks maybe you don't, so there are decks this might not be a great fit, but it certainly is never going to be bad. This is always going to be a good card in any commander deck. Now, people will say, isn't that true with one with the multiverse as well? And yeah, I guess so. These cards are very comparable where they are just really great cards that can go in any deck. Once again, though, I give the colorless card the nod. This can go literally in any commander deck. That's why it's higher up the list for me. It's definitely going to see play in the format. Coming in at number 4, Scholar of New Horizons, and here we go again. You know, we of course with every set now have to have the Let's Help White draw cards, and we also have to have the Let's Help White ramp, and this is another fantastic option in my opinion. So Scholar of New Horizons, 1 and a white, Human Scout 1/1. Scholar of New Horizons enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, okay? So it's going to be a 2/2 when it enters the battlefield. Tap, remove a counter from a permanent you control. Search your library for a Plains card and reveal it. If an opponent controls more lands than you, you may put that card onto the battlefield tapped. If you don't, put it onto the battlefield, put it in your hand, then shuffle. So I just think this is a phenomenal card. Again, it shoehorns its way into so many decks, and it is doing the clause that the white land search cards are starting to do now, which is if your opponent doesn't have more lands than you, it still does something. It's not completely useless. A lot of the older cards, like Knight of the White Orchid is one I used a lot, and I stopped using because if I get to a situation where my opponent has more lands than you, now I'm just paying 2 white mana for a 2/2 with first strike. That doesn't seem great. A lot of those older white cards that would get lands would just shut off if your opponent had as much lands as you or less. The newer ones don't care about that. If your opponent has more lands than you, right, and it's just an opponent, can be any opponent, I put it directly onto the battlefield tapped. That's fantastic. And of course, this isn't a one-shot like Knight of the White Orchid. This is repeatable. But if I got into the situation where I'm caught up on lands, now I still get to put it into my hand. And I can just keep doing this every single turn, right? Now, I need to remove a counter. So worst case scenario here is this card comes into play with a counter on it, and I can use it with its own counter, of course, and get a land. So again, I'm now in the situation where I've put one land into play tapped, or at the very least into my hand, which that alone makes this card worth it in my opinion. But now, if I'm in any deck that has a lot of counters lying around, which a whole bunch do, I can just repeatedly keep doing this over and over and over and over again. And I'm playing against some green deck that is ramping every turn, and I can keep doing the same. I can keep pace with that green deck. They ramp on every turn, and then on my turn, now they have more lands than me again, so I will remove a counter and I will ramp again. Removing a counter means any counter from any permanent, so even if your commander is a planeswalker like an Amanatu or something, this guy might be a great fit because you can do it there as well. Really, really great card that I definitely think is going to see play in the format. Coming in at number 3, Sardinian Avenger. And of course, all of the cards at the top of this list are going to be the cards that are actually from the Commander decks because they're intended to play in the Commander format, obviously. So 1 in a red, Goblin Warrior. 1/1 has First Strike and Trample. When Sardinian Avenger attacks, it gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of artifacts your opponents control. And whenever an artifact an opponent controls is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, Sardinian Avenger deals 1 damage to that player. Man, this card to me seems like just a very obvious response to all of the treasure tokens in the format. This is just treasure token hater.card or something, right? You look at this next to Dockside Extortionist, there's two guys that don't like each other very much. And no matter what the situation is there, my opponent plays the Dockside Extortionist, makes a bunch of treasure tokens, they got to use them right away. You're basically sort of forcing your opponent to use them right away, right? Because if they make 10 treasure tokens and don't use them right away, now on your turn, when you attack with your Sardinian Avenger, it's going to get +10/+0 because your opponent has those 10 artifact tokens. And I mean, if they got a bunch of other artifacts, it's going to get even bigger. And has First Strike and Trample, so the fact that it has 1 toughness doesn't really mean anything. I'm essentially attacking with a 12/12 trample creature or whatever, right? But if they want to use those treasure tokens right away, we're going to make them pay for that as well, because whenever they sack one of those treasure tokens, it is going to the graveyard from the battlefield, and we will deal 1 damage to them. Fantastic card in a commander game, I think. Coming in at number 2, Disciple of Callous Nin. 4 in a white human wizard, 3/4. When Disciple of Callous Nin enters the battlefield, starting with you, each player chooses up to 5 permanents they control. All permanents other than Disciple of Callous Nin that weren't chosen this way phase out. Permanents can't phase in. So I probably have this card a lot higher on this list than a lot of people would. I think this is a fantastic card. I like to give a lot of props to cards that are doing something unique and interesting that we've never really seen before, because those cards in the long run, I find, tend to have a bigger impact on the Commander format and in the game of Magic in general. Actually, you look at my number 10 Bitter Reunion, I think that's a card that's definitely going to fit in way more decks than does Disciple of Callous Nin. But, you know, there's a lot of draw discard effects out there. We definitely do not have any other effects that are doing what this is doing. So I think some explanation is required with this card before I get into how we can use it. So it's going to enter the battlefield. Everyone's going to choose 5 permanents, and then all the rest are going to phase out, except your Disciple of Callous Nin. So you're already up a permanent over everyone else because you get 5 and also your Disciple. So you're going to have 6 total. Everyone else only gets 5. I love effects like this in general. This harkens back to the original purpose of white, which was the balancing effects, right? Actual balance is banned in the format. Balancing Act, another one that I like a lot, is going to be a card that not a lot of other people are going to like. I like cards like that. Balancing out the game is fun. I also think it's a fun, interesting way to play out the game, having people try to decide, what am I going to pick? And a lot of times it's going to be based off what your opponent picks. And it is really important here that this says starting with you. So you're going to pick your stuff first, and then the next next guy in turn order is going to go, and they're going to pick probably based off what you pick, and then so on and so forth. So I guess the last guy in turn order is going to sort of get the advantage because they get to see what everyone else has already picked, and they're going to pick their stuff based on what everyone else picked. I kind of like stuff like that. I think it's an interesting almost mini game inside of the game. I also like the balancing effects, right? For everyone complaining always about the Simic ramp and card draw and all that kind of stuff, this is the effects that you need because it balances it out. It doesn't matter if my opponent has 20 lands and I have 5. Now we both have 5, right? That's why cards like this need to exist in the game. Now, the other really important part about this card is permanents can't phase in. That is a line of text that is incredibly unique. So just that line of text alone, you can use for other things. For example, one of my favorite cards, Vidolian Illusionist, phases out target creature. So if permanents can't phase in, I can phase out my opponent's creature and then it won't phase back in. Typically, and I guess I should explain the rules here a little bit on phasing, when you phase something out, it phases in on the untap of that player's next turn. So on my turn, everything's going to phase in on untap. It sort of happens simultaneously. In this case, because you are phasing out everyone else's stuff, if someone removes my disciple, now the stuff stays phased out until their next turn, right? So on the next person's untap, their stuff that was phased out by my disciple will phase back in, and then on the next person's turn and so forth. It doesn't all phase in at once. It only phases in on untap on that person's turn, right? The other important thing is, man, does a Teferi's Protection ever become horrible with a Disciple of Callous Nin in play? It basically shuts that card off, and since you're in white, you probably should be careful with this. This card, it'll screw you. It's basically game over for you, right? Because all your permanents will remain phased out permanently, right? They won't phase back in, but the until your next turn, your life total can't change and you have protection from everything, that wears off on your next turn, right? So on your next turn, the protections is going to wear off, but your permanents will remain phased out. So you're basically just a sitting duck. Either way, it is an incredibly impactful card in the Commander format, I think, and I'm definitely going to try to fit it into some of my decks. But coming in at number 1 is an even more impactful card, and in my opinion, the most impactful Magic card we've seen in a very, very long time, not just in the Commander format, but in Magic in general. I already made a video about it because it needed to be talked about right away. I'm sure this card has been talked about a ton. There's lots of people on different sides of the fence about it. You always see that whenever there's a card that's big and flashy and is doing something very unique. You always have the people that maybe are overreacting a little, and you also have the people that are sort of dismissing it like it's no big deal. Whatever your opinion on the matter is, there is no doubt that Root Path Purifier is an incredibly impactful card in the Commander format and in the game of Magic in general, because we've never ever seen a card that does this before, and it is a really powerful effect. I don't think that you can argue that, right? So 3 and a green elf druid 3/4. Lands you control and land cards in your library are basic. That is an incredibly, entirely unique effect that we've never seen before that enables you to do a lot of really busted things. Now, are people going to play this card a lot? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. Again, I don't make these lists just for here's going to be the most popular cards from this set in the format. I make these lists more for the cards that are just incredibly impactful and unique and can end up changing how other cards even interact with what your deck is doing, right? And that's why I saved Disciple of Callous Nin and Root Path Purifier as the top 2 spots, because those were the ones that I think were in the long run the most impactful on the format. If you haven't watched my video or anyone else's video about what this card can do, I'm just going to go through a couple of examples, all right? So lands you control on the battlefield are going to be basic, which means if I play a back to basics, non-basic lands don't untap, all my lands are now basic, which means they're not non-basic. So the back to basics will not affect me, right? Similarly, a Blood Moon will not affect me because all my lands are now basic. All the lands I have in play, the ones I control, are all considered to be basic lands. The most impactful and powerful part about this card, though, is that all my lands in my library are basic. So now I can very easily use something like a Rampant Growth or a Sakura Tribe Elder, which searches for a basic land, get my Cabal Coffers, or my Gaia's Cradle and put it directly onto the battlefield. That seems pretty good, right? Or I can cast my Boundless Realms and get like 10 or 15 non-basic lands of any kind and put them directly into play. And I know people will say, oh, well, Scapeshift already does that. Yeah, well, Scapeshift doesn't do that. Scapeshift has to sacrifice all the lands you have in play in order to get a bunch of other lands, so it doesn't actually do that. And yes, there are already combos that will enable you to get a Gaia's Cradle or a Cabal Coffers in play or a Dark Depths Thespian Stage. You know, of course, that stuff's been going on forever. That particular scenario where you're using this card is not unique, of course not. But Scapeshift is certainly not doing what Rootpath Purifier is doing, not by a long shot. Scapeshift's not going to help you against Back to Basics, right? So Rootpath Purifier is doing that one thing that sort of Scapeshift can do, but also it's doing that whole bunch of other stuff as well, right? Doing a whole bunch stapled on one card that is entirely unique and is incredibly impactful and has the potential to be incredibly powerful as well. So I think this card deserves the #1 spot on this list. But let me know in the comments below what you guys thought of this set. Again, I don't think it's incredibly impactful on the Commander format. There was some pretty good cards from the actual Commander decks, like the top 5 spots on this list that I think are definitely going to see play in the format and are really impactful. Are they going to see a lot of play though? Like a Rootpath Purifier or a Disciple of Callous Nin, again, I think are impactful cards in the format, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be super popular because they are kind of niche. I will be going over a whole bunch of cards that are sort of on the fence for me, right? Other than just making a list of here's what I think are the best cards for the format, I also like to go over a lot of the other cards that might be good as well. So I will be coming out with another video right away about a whole bunch of cards from this set that I think are definitely playable in the format, that are sort of on the fence, I guess, weren't good enough to make my list. And of course, I will also be doing the top commanders from this set as well. So stay tuned for that. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.